Hey guys! Tonight we begin a slow drift into a world that might feel almost impossibly small and yet astonishingly vast at the same time. You trudge through the warm, dusty air of a West African marketplace centuries ago, feeling the sun press down on your shoulders as brass glints at your feet. Tiny figures, lions, elephants, even miniature market stalls lie in neat rows on wooden tables. Each one a weight, a story, a measure of value. You probably won't survive this fully awake, but that's okay. The magic is in letting your mind wander alongside these delicate objects. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, leave your location and local time in the comments, so we can imagine this journey together across time zones. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lean closer to inspect a small lion, its tail curled just so, the craftsmanship so fine that you can almost imagine the artisan squinting under the flicker of a fire, filing and hammering with a patience you'd usually reserve for scrolling through your phone. Historians still argue whether these weights were merely functional, precise measures for gold dust, or if they held deeper, symbolic meanings tied to power and spiritual protection. Either way, you feel the weight of centuries in your hand, or at least the sense of it. Because touching one of these figures would be like shaking hands with a ghost of the port. Marketplace. Gold itself isn't the first thing you notice. It's the way the tiny brass objects catch the light, reflecting a sheen almost like water rippling across the Niger River. Each weight is calibrated to balance against gold dust, and yet, somehow, each is a miniature narrative. You pause at a figure of a small, crouching figure with exaggerated arms, maybe performing a ritual, maybe just dancing. Historians still argue whether the gestures corresponded to actual ceremonial moves or were purely decorative. Quirky as it seems, some weights show tiny humans riding oversized animals, possibly elephants, possibly imagination running wild like a medieval comic strip in metal. You step back and breathe, noticing the subtle scents of brass and smoke from nearby fires. A marketplace, alive with the rhythm of trading voices. Imagine a merchant counting gold dust, laying it out on a piece of cloth, and then carefully placing one of these small weights atop the pile. Each transaction is a silent conversation, an unspoken agreement that carries trust, reputation, and perhaps a hint of superstition. You might think, well, that's a lot of weight for such a tiny piece. But these little objects are the backbone of commerce, the silent accountants of a thriving economy that stretched across rivers and savannaceous. These weights emerged in what we often think of as the Ghana Empire era, around the 9th to 11th centuries, though their use expanded and evolved over centuries. Imagine a craftsman in the morning, melting metals over a fire fueled by palm husks, carefully pouring into molds carved with intricate designs. You can almost see the air waver above the flames, the smell of molten brass tangling with the scent of dry earth and river mud. Quirky fact: some molds were made of clay mixed with cow dung, which may have contributed to their durability. Not very glamorous, but effective. Historians still argue whether this was purely practical, or if the dung had symbolic protective properties. As you trace your finger along the edge of a tiny elephant, the narrative becomes clearer. Each animal and human figure is not just a weight, it's a mnemonic device, a story waiting to be told, a moral lesson tucked into a trade tool. You probably won't survive remembering every detail, but that's fine. Let the imagination roam. Maybe the tiny lion signifies courage in the face of desert bandits. Or perhaps it's a subtle reminder of a king's authority. These figures are historical shorthand, encoding the ethos of an entire culture into objects, small enough to fit in your palm. And just as you start imagining yourself as one of those merchants, winding through dust-choked roads or along riverbanks lined with papyrus boats, you notice the playful details. A tiny human balancing a fish, a pair of dancers locked midst, a leopard's tail curled with such precision you almost expect it to twitch. Historians still argue whether such attention to detail was meant to instruct, amuse, or simply display artisan skill. But the effect is mesmerizing. You lean closer, almost whispering to the brass figures, feeling a connection across time. This is the world of West African gold weights, and it is a world of contrasts. Small objects, massive influence, precise measures, playful artistry, practical tools, spiritual artifacts. You trudge through it slowly, letting your senses absorb each detail: the sun, the brass, the smells of market fires, the gentle hum of distant voices. They all mingle, wrapping you in a kind of timeless lullaby. And perhaps, just perhaps, as you drift along this path, you'll start to appreciate that gold dust is more than wealth. It's a language, a story, a pulse of civilization in miniature. You keep walking, though walking here means more of a slow, dreamy drift through a marketplace that has no end, only endless rows of tiny brass animals. Lions, elephants, crocodiles, they all stare at you with their frozen, metallic eyes, as if daring you to guess their stories. You probably won't survive keeping track of them all, but that's fine. Part of the magic is letting your mind blur the details. Remember that first lion you saw? Its miniature mane still gleams in your mental sunlight. Now imagine hundreds more, each one slightly different. Each one carrying subtle hints about culture, morality, or the personal whimsy of an artisan you'll never meet. So many animals were depicted not because the makers were obsessed with wildlife documentaries, but because these creatures were powerful symbols in West African life. Historians still argue whether lions were chosen primarily for their social dominance, spiritual protection, or just because artisans liked sculpting manes. Crocodiles show up frequently, lounging as though they own the riverbanks. You trudge past one, and for a moment, you think it might wink at you, but that's just your imagination. Fringe tidbit: some weights exaggerate animal features to the point of caricature, like a hippo with disproportionately tiny legs, or an elephant whose trunk curls around itself like a pretzel. Scholars debate whether this was playful exaggeration or an attempt to highlight symbolic traits for traders who might have been illiterate. You can almost hear the gentle chuckle of the artisan as they carved these details, a tiny joke frozen forever in metal. Elephants, of course, dominate the scene in both size and meaning. They're slow, strong, and majestic, and that made them perfect emblems of wealth and stability. You can imagine a trader weighing gold dust on a balanced scale, carefully placing a small elephant weight atop it, nodding with satisfaction at the balance. Historians still argue whether elephants were also intended to invoke protection or simply represent power and reliability. Some figures include riders atop these elephants, though their tiny limbs often look too stubby to actually hold on. Proof that practicality often bowed to artistry. As you wander, notice the smaller, less obvious creatures: birds perched delicately on branches, frogs crouching as if mid-jump, tiny ants, so many ants that you wonder if the artisan had a secret fondness for colony life. Quirky fact: a few weights depict hybrid animals, like a crocodile with wings, or a lion with human hands. No one knows exactly why these oddities exist. Some suggest they were riddles or conversation starters for merchants waiting for customers. You probably won't survive trying to catalogue every hybrid, But that's part of the sleepy charm of this world. Now let's consider scale and placement. The size of the animal often matched the weight it represented, creating a kind of visual logic that even a tired, sleepy observer can follow. Imagine holding a tiny, squat lion in one hand and a slightly taller elephant in the other, feeling the subtle difference in mass as you set them on the scales. Scholars debate whether the sizing conventions were strictly standardized, or if artisans allowed for personal whimsy. Some weights might be slightly heavier than necessary, a secret tip for favored traders, though no one can prove it definitively. You notice playful human-animal combinations too, like a bird-headed figure balancing on a fish or a tiny person wrestling a crocodile. These scenes hint at stories, myths, or local folktales, but they're never explicit, leaving your imagination to fill in the blanks. Fringe thought, perhaps some weights were coded messages, or mnemonic devices, helping merchants remember complex trade routes or agreements. You probably won't survive deciphering all of them, but that doesn't matter. You're here to feel the texture, the rhythm, the life embedded in metal. The casting process itself adds another layer of intrigue. Artisans used lost wax techniques, pouring molten brass into wax models, then melting the wax away to leave the final shape. You can almost smell the warm metal and see the faint traces of smoke rising as the artisan works. A quiet, rhythmic dance of creation. Some weights even retain tiny imperfections, like a smudge or crack, humanizing the artifact and reminding you that history isn't perfect, it's lived, messy, and beautiful. Historians still argue whether these imperfections were accidental or deliberately symbolic. A kind of signature or talisman. By now, your mind drifts between observation and imagination. You trudge past elephants, crouching crocodiles, and hybrid monsters, feeling the subtle pulse of history through their brass forms. Each animal has a story, a significance, a weight literally and figuratively that links trade, culture, and belief systems together. You probably won't survive keeping all their meanings straight, but that's the point. These objects are less about information and more about sensation, narrative, and the gentle rhythm of human creativity. And just as you start to feel overwhelmed by the sheer number of creatures, your senses soften, letting the repetitive, almost hypnotic patterns of lions and crocodiles lull you into a slower, dreamier pace. The sun's warmth fades into a gentle glow, and the metallic sheen of the figures starts to feel like fireflies trapped in brass, blinking slowly in the dimming light. It's here, in the pause between observing and imagining, that the world of West African symbolic animals truly comes alive. A quiet, enduring heartbeat beneath the chaos of trade, artistry, and human ambition. You trudge deeper into this world, where everyday life has been shrunk into brass, captured in miniature scenes that are surprisingly expressive. You probably won't survive noticing every tiny nuance, but that's part of the gentle thrill. Your brain drifts in and out like a lazy river, catching glimpses of activity frozen in time. Look, there's a weight depicting a bustling market stall, tiny baskets of goods, little figures bending and stretching, some carrying items that look far too large for their bodies. Historians still argue whether these depictions were meant as accurate snapshots of daily life, or if they were idealized, almost theatrical renditions designed to impress or entertain. As you examine a miniature baker rolling dough on a tiny table, you realize that these weights weren't just functional, they were storytelling devices. Quirky fact: some figures include what looks like miniature pets wandering through the stalls, and one even has a cat perched atop a basket, tail flicking, Probably because the artisan had seen one cat chase chickens and thought, yes, this is worth immortalizing in brass. You imagine the subtle humor of the maker, transferring a fleeting moment of amusement into a solid, lasting object that would circulate among traders for decades. Dancers appear too, frozen mid-step, some with arms outstretched, and others caught in a spin that would be impossible to hold in real life. Their presence suggests that celebration and ritual were just as important to these communities as trade itself. You probably won't survive noticing the delicate detail of their tiny jewelry or the folds of their garments. But let your imagination fill in the rhythms of music and laughter that once accompanied these scenes. Historians still argue whether the poses of dancers correspond to real ceremonial dances or if they were purely artistic inventions. Even labor and domestic chores make their way into the collection. A woman pounding grain, a child tugging at a basket, a man balancing a load of firewood on his head. Each figure demonstrates a surprisingly dynamic understanding of weight, balance, and human form. The craftsmen were essentially miniature choreographers, orchestrating scenes that merged function and narrative. Fringe tidbit. Some weights exaggerate effort in funny ways. Like a tiny man bent so far backward you wonder if he'll tip over, as if the artisan wanted to give traders a visual giggle in between serious transactions. You trudge past figures, depicting animals interacting with humans, reminding you that life was intertwined with nature. There's a dog nipping at a child's ankle, a monkey dangling from a tree, a chicken strutting proudly. Each creature isn't just an ornament, it carries symbolic significance, often reflecting moral lessons or social hierarchies. Historians still argue whether certain animals were chosen primarily for storytelling purposes, or if they were subtle markers of trade value, almost like a secret code among merchants. The scale of the scenes can be dizzying in its complexity. Picture a tiny marketplace in the palm of your hand, complete with traders, customers, animals, and goods all arranged so that you could almost walk through it if only you were a few millimeters tall. Quirky fact: some weights even include miniature musical instruments, like drums or flutes, reinforcing the sense that these communities valued art, leisure, and sound as much as trade and survival. You probably won't survive cataloging all the instruments, but you can hear the faint echo of music as your mind drifts along with the figures now. Consider the tactile experience of these weights. You pick one up and feel the smooth curves, the cool metal against your fingertips, the subtle bumps where casting left tiny imperfections. Each object was designed to fit comfortably on a scale, yet every tiny details, the arch of a back, the tilt of a head, the flick of a tail, was deliberately chosen. Historians still argue whether artisans followed rigid conventions for these forms or allowed for personal expression, almost like graffiti artists, centuries ahead of their time. As you wander, notice the overlapping layers of narrative: work, play, ceremony, ritual. Each weight carries multiple stories simultaneously, some obvious, some hidden. You probably won't survive decoding all of them, and that's okay. The charm lies in letting the scenes wash over you, feeling the rhythm of life preserved in brass. Fringe tidbit. One weight shows a child seemingly balancing a whole village on their head. An exaggeration, yes, but also a playful reminder that life often feels heavier than it truly is, and just as the marketplace stretches on endlessly, so too does the sense of timelessness. You trudge past children, traders, dancers, and animals, feeling a gentle drowsiness settle in. The scenes invite you to pause, to notice the small gestures, the quiet stories, and the subtle humor embedded in every curve. Even if you never know exactly what the artisan intended, the miniature narratives create a lullaby of human experience, work, play, care, and whimsy, all captured in metal. By the time you let go of the last dancer, the last market stall, you are floating gently in the rhythm of these tiny lives, attuned to the cadence of a world both long gone and enduringly present. The market, though silent now, hums softly in your imagination, a warm, golden glow of brass reflecting sunlight and centuries of quiet observation. It's here, in this delicate intersection of history and story, that you begin to understand the true charm of these weights. Not just measures of gold, but measures of human life, condensed and preserved for a future self to wander through. Slowly, thoughtfully, sleepily, you trudge onward, though your steps feel slower now, weighted with the knowledge that every piece of brass you see has been meticulously crafted, often with secret techniques lost to time. Metals and methods are where the magic quietly hides, tiny alchemy performed by hands that knew fire, wax, and patience better than most modern chemists know chemistry. You probably won't survive memorizing the formulas, but that's fine. The wonder is in imagining molten metal flowing into intricate molds, carrying both story and function in one hot, glimmering pour. Historians still argue whether specific alloys were chosen for durability, aesthetic shine, or symbolic meaning, though every piece seems to have a subtle glow, almost whispering secrets of its creation. Lost wax casting is the primary technique, and here's where artistry meets practicality. A craftsman would first create a wax model, delicate enough to show the smallest detail, a leopard's spots, a dancer's flowing skirt, even the bend of a tiny human finger, fringe tidbit. Some wax models included hidden Easter eggs, like tiny dots or lines that had private meanings for the artisan or favored clients. You probably won't survive spotting them all, but just thinking about them is enough to spark a gentle smile in your drowsy mind. Once the wax was perfected, it would be covered in clay, dried, and then baked to melt the wax, leaving a hollow mold ready for molten brass. As you imagine molten metal being poured, the air filled with faint smoke and a coppery temps, consider the skill required to maintain the correct temperature. Too hot, and the molten brass could warp the fine details. Too cold, and it wouldn't fill the mold. You can almost hear the quiet hum of concentration, the artisan's careful adjustments, and maybe a whispered curse when a batch fails. Historians still argue whether apprentices were used extensively or whether most artisans were solitary geniuses perfecting their craft over decades. Some weights were alloyed with traces of copper, tin, or even zinc, which altered their color, hardness, and durability. Quirky fact: a few rare weights are slightly magnetic due to tiny amounts of iron, likely accidental, but it gives them an unexpected quirkiness, like holding a tiny artifact with a secret hidden property. You probably won't survive remembering all the subtle differences in alloys, but notice how each choice contributes to the tactile and visual richness of the piece, the way light reflects, the way weight sits in your hand. Now, think about mold preparation. Artisans would inscribe designs not only on the surface, but sometimes inside the mold walls to add subtle textures to the figure, like a sunken line suggesting fur or hair. Some of these internal details only become apparent under bright light, almost like a hidden layer of story that only the most attentive traders or collectors might see. Historians still argue whether these details served practical purposes, like making the figures easier to handle, or were purely decorative, adding layers of meaning for those who understood the codes. Polishing and finishing added the final touches. After casting weights were often hammered gently to remove excess material, then burnished to create a smooth, gleaming surface. Fringe tidbit. Some artisans would intentionally leave tiny imperfections, like a minuscule bump or irregularity, as a signature or charm. You probably won't survive identifying each maker by these marks, but the effect is a sense of humanity embedded in every object, a reminder that even in standardized trade, creativity thrived. You trudge along, feeling as though you can almost smell the mix of clay dust, melting metal, and burning fuel, the invisible orchestra behind every tiny animal and figure. The techniques weren't purely technical. They were steeped in knowledge passed down through generations, a combination of observation, experimentation, and ritual. Historians still argue whether certain casting steps had symbolic meaning, like protective charms to ensure the metal didn't crack or fail, or if they were purely practical traditions, hardened into habit over time. Consider the ingenuity required to balance function and beauty. Each weight had to measure gold accurately, but it also needed to tell a story, fit comfortably on a scale, and appeal to both traders and rulers. You probably won't survive imagining every decision, but your mind drifts pleasantly among them, the balance between the practical and the aesthetic, the mundane and the symbolic, the everyday and the extraordinary. By the time you've wandered through these workshops in your mind, you feel a quiet admiration for the artisans. Their patience, precision, and subtle humor echo across centuries. Every groove, curve, and imperfection is evidence of a human hand, a thoughtful mind, and a culture that valued both commerce and storytelling. You trudge forward, lighter now for having glimpsed the alchemy behind the weights, aware that the next step in your journey will carry you from the workshops to the marketplaces themselves, where these tiny masterpieces danced between buyers, sellers, and the endless flow of gold dust. You trudge forward, leaving the glow of molten metal and the quiet hum of artisan workshops behind, and step into the rhythm of the market itself. Traders bustle about, balancing trays of gold dust, weighing it against the tiny brass objects you've been following. You probably won't survive noticing every gesture, the nods, the subtle eye signals, the careful adjustments, but that's fine. You're not here to memorize. You're here to feel the pulse of commerce. Historians still argue whether these markets were primarily economic centers or social hubs where alliances and gossip flowed as freely as gold dust. Picture a merchant carefully shaking a tiny elephant weight in his palm, ensuring it balances perfectly against a small pile of gold. Fringe tidbit. Some traders would carry lucky weights, pieces that were slightly off-standard but believed to bring prosperity or avert misfortune. You probably won't survive cataloging which merchants had these charms, but imagining them gives you a sense of the personality and superstition threaded through everyday transactions. Every weighing is not just arithmetic. It's a ritual, a quiet performance of trust, precision, and perhaps a little showmanship. As you wander past the stalls, you notice the interplay of human and animal weights. A crocodile might sit atop a pile of gold dust, a reminder of the river's dangers, while a tiny lion might preside over a negotiation, silently asserting dominance. Traders weren't just balancing metal, they were balancing stories, symbolism, and authority. Historians still argue whether certain motifs were standardized for all markets, or if local preferences dictated which animals appeared more often. Quirky fact: some merchants decorated their scales and tables with additional brass miniatures that weren't official Waitsteiny dancers, musicians, even a pair of monkeys, purely for amusement or as conversation starters. You probably won't survive noticing every oddity, but each one adds life to the market. reminding you that commerce was social, playful, and sometimes mischievous. These little extras humanize the process, showing that behind every measured gram of gold dust is a merchant with a personality, a sense of humor, and perhaps a soft spot for whimsy. Now, imagine the sounds of the market, the rhythmic clink of brass, the soft rustle of dust on cloth, distant calls of vendors hawking goods, the occasional laugh at a comical miniature figure placed just so. Each noise is punctuated by the careful placement of weights on scales, the subtle tug of negotiation, the careful balancing of trust and currency. Historians still argue whether sound played a role in transactions, like tapping a weight to confirm authenticity, or if it was incidental to the rhythm of trade. You trudge along a riverbank now, imagining boats laden with gold dust arriving from distant towns. Traders unload, carrying tiny brass weights to measure every transaction with precision. Fringe tidbit: some weights were designed to fit specific scales, almost like keys in a lock, so that only certain merchants could use them effectively. You probably won't survive keeping track of all these secret pairings, but it adds a layer of intrigue. Commerce wasn't just numbers, it was strategy, trust, and subtle power plays. Every exchange carries layers of meaning beyond mere economics. A lion weight might signal authority, an elephant reliability, a crocodile caution. Traders relied on these symbols as silently persuasive tools, not just as measures. Historians still argue whether some motifs conveyed hidden social or political messages, perhaps communicating loyalty, rivalry, or status without a single word spoken. You can almost feel the tension in the air as a negotiation unfolds, each weight a tiny ambassador of meaning, each gram of gold dust a vote of confidence in honesty, skill, or superstition. By the time you step back from the bustling river market in your mind, you sense the interconnectedness of the entire trade network. Weights and gold dust move across towns and rivers, carried by merchants whose lives are measured not only by profit but by social ties, reputation, and the careful balance of ritual and practicality. You probably won't survive memorizing every path or every nuance, but you feel it, the rhythm, the dance, the subtle heartbeat of centuries of commerce. The market hums around you, alive with brass, gold, and human energy, a living stage where art and trade meet in perfect harmony. And as you drift past the final row of tables, you notice that even the tiniest weight tells multiple stories. The artisan's skill, the cultural symbolism, the trader's personality, and the broader social context. Each piece is a silent companion, a witness to human endeavor, a small but potent thread in the tapestry of history. You trudge onward, carrying with you the gentle lull of commerce, the clink of brass, and the imagined warmth of sun-baked marketplaces that have long since vanished from the physical world, but remain vivid in your mind. You trudge onward, leaving the clamor of marketplaces behind, and now your steps carry you toward the halls and courts, where kings and local rulers once held sway. Royal patronage was more than just financial support. It shaped the very form and function of the gold weights you've been following. You probably won't survive noticing every subtle nuance of design, but that's fine. The experience is about feeling the weight of authority and artistry blending together. The subtle hum of power coursing through brass and gold. Historians still argue whether rulers commissioned certain motifs to assert dominance, curry favor, or simply because they appreciated the miniature artistry themselves. Imagine a king reclining on a carved wooden throne, attendants bustling round him as a craftsman carefully presents a series of newly minted weights. Fringe tidbit: Some rulers were said to test their loyalty or intelligence by asking traders to interpret the symbols on a weight before allowing them to transact. You probably won't survive keeping track of all the variations, but the concept gives you a sense of how deeply symbolic these small objects could be. Each weight is not merely functional, it is a tiny envoy of culture, politics, and authority. Kings often influenced which animals or human figures appeared most frequently. Lions might signify courage and protection, elephants, stability and endurance, while crocodiles might hint at vigilance or the lurking dangers of political rivalry. The shapes weren't just aesthetic. They carried messages only those attuned to courtly symbolism might fully understand. Historians still argue whether certain motifs were intended as direct political commentary, or simply as decorative preferences reflecting personal taste and aesthetic sensibility. You trudge down imaginary corridors of royal courts, hearing the faint echo of ceremonial drums, the soft rustle of silk garments, and the occasional murmur of advisors. Weights were not confined to markets. They traveled to palaces as gifts, tribute, or tools of statecraft. Fringe tidbit. Some weights depict miniature warriors or attendants that may have doubled as political reminders. Miniature courtly portraits or subtle affirmations of loyalty. You probably won't survive noticing every figure's tiny expression or pose, but the craftsmanship communicates a quiet elegance and precision that mirrors the ruler's authority. Consider the process of commissioning these weights. Artisans would receive instructions that combine technical specifications, symbolic meaning, and aesthetic taste. Some rulers required exact ratios for trade purposes. Others demanded specific motifs to signal their power, lineage, or political ambitions. Historians still argue whether artisans were granted creative freedom within these parameters or if deviation could result in serious disfavor. Either way, the interaction between patron and maker was delicate and layered with nuance. You trudge through imagined royal workshops, where skilled hands pour molten metal and carve intricate patterns under the watchful eye of a court official. There is a rhythm, here fire, wax, clay, brass interwoven with the soft murmur of discussions about symbolism, morality, and politics. Fringe tidbit. One king reportedly insisted that all weights feature a tiny representation of a sacred animal, believing it would bless the kingdom's wealth. You probably won't survive recalling every royal preference, but the thought of these secret mandates adds a rich texture to the story. Royal influence extended beyond mere visual motifs. Some weights carried subtle numerical cues, indicating quantities, trade routes, or even tribute obligations. A lion weight might represent a fixed amount of gold dust for local trade, while an elephant weight might be reserved for dealings with other kingdoms. Historians still argue whether these numeric codes were standardized across regions or adapted locally to suit each ruler's economy and administrative needs. Even the smallest details, the tilt of a tail, the curl of a trunk, the posture of a dancer, could carry hidden messages. You probably won't survive decoding each microsymbol, but letting your mind wander through these details is part of the gentle charm. Each weight becomes a miniature testament to a culture where politics, commerce, and art were inseparable, layered with meaning that only a careful observer might sense. You imagine the quiet pride of artisans delivering their weights to a king, each piece inspected, praised, or critiqued. Perhaps a weight depicting a warrior is subtly adjusted to mirror the king's own posture, or a dancer slightly altered to reflect a favored courtly performance. Fringe tidbit. Some artisans were rumored to embed tiny, playful, or subversive touches, like a smirk on a lion or a mischievous tail curled, that only those with keen eyes or insider knowledge might notice. Historians still argue whether such touches were acts of personal expression, clever humor, or subtle political commentary. By the time you drift past the imagined throne room, you sense the immense influence royal patronage had on these small objects. The weights were no longer simply measures of gold, they were instruments of culture, loyalty, and subtle communication. You probably won't survive remembering every nuance, but the atmosphere lingers, the glint of brass, the soft shuffle of attendants, the quiet authority of rulers influencing artisans' hands. It's a gentle reminder that even the smallest objects can carry immense weight, and that behind every crafted lion, elephant, or dancer, there was a conversation between human ambition, artistry, and history itself. Asterisk, asterisk. You trudge onward, and the air shifts again, not marketplaces, not royal halls, but a quieter, subtler realm where symbolism and spirituality intertwine. Cultural symbols become the focus now, layers of meaning embedded in each tiny weight. You probably won't survive noticing every hidden nuance, but that's part of the gentle thrill, the way a curled tail or a dancer's posture can carry messages of protection, fertility, or morality. Historians still argue whether the symbolic meanings were universally understood, or if some were intended only for insiders within the local community. Picture a tiny figure holding an object over its head, a pose repeated in several weights. Fringe tidbit. Some scholars suggest this represents an offering to ancestors, or a ritual invocation for good fortune in trade. You probably won't survive discerning each ritual nuance, but letting your mind wander among these possibilities is enough to evoke a sense of the spiritual heartbeat embedded in daily life. These small figures weren't just decorative, they were conveyors of belief, reminders of unseen forces, guardians of fortune, and silent witnesses to human activity. Animals frequently carry spiritual weight as well. The crocodile, already a symbol of caution and riverine power, might also serve as a talisman against danger, while the lion can represent courage, leadership, or even ancestral strength. Fringe tidbit. One tiny chameleon weight may indicate adaptability, a reminder for traders to adjust their tactics in shifting markets or unpredictable political climates. Historians still argue whether some animal symbolism originated in local folk stories, religious practices, or was borrowed from neighboring regions' iconography. Humans appear in ritual contexts too. You trudge past a figure kneeling with outstretched hands, another dancing mid-spin, another carrying a basket atop their head in a stylized, exaggerated form. Each pose could indicate a ceremonial act, a moral lesson, or simply an artistic convention. You probably won't survive remembering every pose, but the repetition creates rhythm and meaning. Fringe tidbit. Some weights show figures engaged in mock combat or wrestling, hinting at initiation rites or competitive games that were part of social or spiritual education. Even the abstract shapes carry symbolic value. Spirals, dots, and geometric designs appear on the base or the back of some weights, sometimes hidden from immediate view. You probably won't survive decoding all of these signs, but letting your imagination linger on them evokes a sense of layered communication, visible and invisible, practical and mystical. Historians still argue whether these abstract elements were mnemonic devices for trade, ritual markers, or coded spiritual symbols intended only for initiated eyes. You trudge past figures with exaggerated features, a large head, elongated arms, or disproportionately small feet signifying spiritual attributes, social roles, or moral lessons. Fringe tidbit. Some weights exaggerate human proportions humorously, possibly to remind traders not to take themselves too seriously, or perhaps to encode ethical guidance with subtle wit. You probably won't survive noticing each one, but the details invite reflection on how humans project values onto tiny objects that circulate in daily life. Now imagine the tactile experience. Each weight cool and smooth in your hand, but its form and curves suggest stories that vibrate faintly beneath the surface. The weight of metal becomes the weight of meaning. Historians still argue whether these tactile qualities were deliberately considered by artisans to enhance their symbolic resonance, or if they emerged organically through craft techniques. Fringe tidbit. Some weights were even worn as amulets or carried on belts, blurring the line between tool, art, and talisman. You trudge slowly, letting your attention drift to the layers beneath the surface. A lion's posture may signal courage, a dancer's spin celebration, a spiral patience, a tiny frog vigilance. Each layer is a quiet conversation across time and space, connecting artisan, trader, ruler, and observer. You probably won't survive following every thread, but the texture of these small objects is enough to feel the pulse of a worldview, a culture where everyday life and spiritual meaning are inseparable. By the time you leave the quiet domain of spiritual symbolism, you carry with you a sense of connection to those who created, used, and interpreted these weights. They are measures not only of gold, but of human experience, belief, morality, humor, and hope, all crystallized in small, enduring forms. You trudge onward, feeling the gentle resonance of a culture that expressed its values, fears, and dreams in the tiniest details, a reminder that history's weight isn't always measured in pounds, it's often measured in meaning. You trudge onward, leaving the quiet spirituality behind, and your mind begins to map the routes these tiny weights traveled, connecting towns, rivers, and kingdoms across West Africa. Trade networks come alive before your eyes, vibrant arteries pulsing with commerce, gossip, and culture. You probably won't survive memorizing every route, river bend, or desert crossing, but that's fine. The charm is in letting your imagination drift along the paths carved by merchants over centuries. Historians still argue whether certain regions controlled these networks more tightly or if authority was diffuse and negotiated through complex local agreements. Picture a boat loaded with gold dust gliding along the Niger River, weights neatly packed to measure every transaction upon arrival. Fringe tidbit. Some weights appear to have been carried along caravans that included disguised spies or political envoys, tiny ambassadors hidden in plain sight. You probably won't survive keeping track of each secret messenger, but it adds intrigue to the journey, suggesting that trade and diplomacy were often intertwined in ways you wouldn't immediately expect. These networks were more than simple economic systems, they were living, breathing ecosystems of trust, negotiation, and strategy. Overland routes through savannas and forests were equally vital. Traders balanced heavy loads of gold dust, carefully placing weights atop piles to ensure accuracy, while also navigating bandits, seasonal floods, and unpredictable terrain. Historians still argue whether certain routes were primarily dictated by geography, or if political alliances shaped the safest and most profitable paths. Fringe tidbit. Some merchants were rumored to use tiny weights as charms, believing that the correct balance could protect them from misfortune on treacherous roads. You probably won't survive tracking all the beliefs, but the blend of practicality and superstition adds texture to the story. Trading hubs in towns like Timbuktu, Jen, and Gao served as crossroads where goods, ideas, and people converged. You trudge past the imagined bustle, traders shouting prices, children weaving through stalls, animals wandering between legs. Gold weights circulated as both tools and objects of intrigue, carrying not just metal but stories, agreements, and social signals. Fringe tidbit: some weights were intentionally marked or personalized to indicate ownership or origin, functioning almost like signatures in a world without modern paper contracts. Historians still argue whether these markings were standardized across regions or unique to each artisan or trader. Consider the journey of a single weight, from artisan workshop to market, across rivers and deserts, passing from hand to hand. Each transfer adds subtle layers of meaning. A weight that starts in one village might travel hundreds of miles, collecting stories and significance along the way. You probably won't survive tracing every step, but feeling the implied motion gives a sense of continuity and connectivity across centuries. Fringe tidbit: some weights display stylistic features from distant regions, hinting at early cultural exchanges, surprising influence, or even artisan migrations. Historians still argue whether these stylistic blends represent direct travel or slow diffusion of artistic conventions. The physicality of these networks is striking. Picture merchants carefully adjusting balances, counting gold dust, and checking miniature animals against scales, all under the hot sun or beside a river's edge. Each act is meticulous, ritualistic, and often playful, a balancing act of commerce, trust, and human interaction. Fringe tidbit: some river merchants reputedly sang while weighing, a soft cadence to ensure concentration and perhaps invoke luck. You probably won't survive remembering every anecdote, but the soundscape adds an almost musical dimension to the journey. You trudge onward, imagining the ripple effect of these networks. A weight crafted in one village influencing trade far downstream, stories of animals, rituals, and morality crossing borders along with gold. Each connection, each handoff, subtly shifts the cultural landscape, and you begin to sense the vast, living network that sustained economies, politics, and culture alike. Historians still argue whether certain routes were dominated by specific ethnic groups, or if power was negotiated fluidly, fluctuating with alliances, marriages, and conflicts. By the time you pause to rest, the enormity of these trade networks sinks in. You carry with you the sense of rivers as highways, caravans as lifelines, and brass weights as both instruments of commerce and vessels of cultural memory. You probably won't survive noting every subtle nuance, but the mental map you carry is enough to feel the breadth, complexity, and enduring wonder of these historical networks, guiding gold and stories alike across the expanse of West Africa. You trudge onward, leaving the trade networks stretching across rivers and deserts behind, and your mind begins to notice the shifts in style, form, and artistic expression across centuries. Artistic evolution is subtle, almost imperceptible at first. But as you focus on the details, the curl of a lion's mane, the stance of a dancing figure, you begin to see a timeline etched in brass. You probably won't survive remembering every nuance, but that's fine. The joy is in observing the rhythms of change and continuity. Historians still argue whether stylistic shifts reflect evolving aesthetics, changing trade needs, or broader cultural influences from neighboring regions. Imagine holding two weights side by side, one from the early Ghana Empire, its lion squat and solid, mane simplified, the other from centuries later, the same lion stretched gracefully, details of muscles and fur etched with finesse. Fringe tidbit. Some weights display hybrid forms, part human, part animal, possibly to demonstrate creative freedom, or perhaps as whimsical commentary on societal roles. You probably won't survive cataloging all these hybrids, but they reveal the playful imagination of artisans across time. Each stylistic decision, subtle or dramatic, carries a story. You trudge past dancers frozen mid-spin, their skirts and arms changing subtly from generation to generation. Early figures are rigid, almost schematic. Later ones are fluid, dynamic, conveying motion and emotion. Fringe tidbit. Some dancers sport exaggerated features, long arms, prominent hands to emphasize gestures or ritual movements, which may have been understood contextually by the local audience. Historians still argue whether these exaggerations were instructional, symbolic, or purely aesthetic, though the effect is mesmerizing. The depiction of animals evolves, to lions become more detailed, elephants more majestic, crocodiles more elongated, sometimes merging features from other regions' iconography. You probably won't survive recalling every nuance, but noticing these stylistic shifts allows you to sense cultural dialogues unfolding over time, where artisans influenced one another across towns, kingdoms, and even centuries. Fringe tidbit. A few rare weights incorporate motifs from European or North African designs, suggesting cross-cultural exposure long before written records hint at such connections. Historians still argue whether these influences were direct, through traveling merchants, or absorbed indirectly through trade networks. Human figures also evolve in posture, proportion, and attire. Early figures may wear simple tunics. Later ones sport jewelry, elaborate hairstyles, or dynamic poses reflecting societal shifts or ceremonial fashions. Fringe tidbit. Some weights include figures with oddly elongated heads or torsos, perhaps indicating a ritualized or stylized depiction of status or role. You probably won't survive remembering each variation, but each tells a subtle story about society's values, hierarchy, and aesthetics. You trudge through imagined workshops again, seeing artisans experiment with molds, tools, and techniques over time. Some innovations were practical, improving durability or weight accuracy, while others were aesthetic, responding to evolving tastes or royal commissions. Historians still argue whether certain stylistic trends spread deliberately as cultural markers or emerged organically through experimentation. Fringe tidbit. A few weights reveal tiny, playful alterations and extra finger, a mischievous smile that suggests artisans were still embedding humor, even as techniques became more sophisticated. By the time you move past the sequence of evolving brass figures, you feel the fluidity of culture itself, ever-changing yet persistent, playful yet meaningful, functional yet artistic. You probably won't survive tracing every line of evolution, but the rhythm of change, the cadence of artistic dialogue across time, is enough to fill your imagination. These small weights are not static objects. They are chronicles of human creativity, negotiation between tradition and innovation, whispers of artisans conversing with the future through brass and gold. You trudge onward with a sense of continuity, understanding that even the tiniest shift in posture, proportion, or feature signals a story of adaptation, dialogue, and cultural memory. The evolution of these weights is less a linear timeline and more a tapestry, where every curve, every exaggeration, every subtle detail reflects centuries of human life, artistic dialogue, and creative impulse, all preserved in the glow of tiny brass objects. You trudge onward, leaving the evolving forms of weights behind, and your mind now drifts toward the modern encounters that brought these tiny treasures into contemporary awareness. Collectors, scholars, and explorers all play their part in the story, often altering the narrative unintentionally through interpretation, display, or acquisition. You probably won't survive noting every museum label or catalog entry, but the effect is in understanding how these objects traveled from practical tools to cultural artifacts admired worldwide. Historians still argue whether European collectors fully appreciated the cultural significance or merely sought aesthetic curiosity. Imagine an explorer in the late 19th century, perhaps dusty from desert travel, holding a tiny brass lion or dancer with awe. Fringe tidbit. Some weights were acquired under dubious circumstances, traded for trivial goods, or even looted, their context lost to time. You probably won't survive remembering all the twists of provenance, but the stories reveal the complex journey from village to gallery, from tool to object to fascination. Each transfer adds layers of interpretation, some faithful, others misinformed, yet all contribute to our modern understanding. Museums today often display weights in glass cases, arranged by size, animal, or human figure. You trudge past imagined exhibits, noting the polished surfaces, labels, and explanatory plaques. Fringe tidbit. Some curators intentionally juxtapose weights from different regions to highlight cross-cultural influences, but others prefer chronological arrangements, emphasizing stylistic evolution. Historians still argue whether these curatorial choices alter perception or enhance comprehension. Either way, the objects themselves quietly narrate stories across centuries. You notice that some collectors became obsessed, meticulously cataloging every animal, dancer, and abstract shape. Tiny deviations, an extra line on a skirt, a slightly curved tailor noted and debated. Fringe tidbit. A few wealthy collectors even commissioned reproductions of certain weights, inadvertently preserving forms that might otherwise have vanished. You probably won't survive tracking every reproduction, but their existence adds another layer of cultural memory and influence. Scholars analyze not only form but function. Weights are studied for metallurgy, casting techniques, and even wear patterns that indicate frequent use. You trudge slowly, imagining a researcher running a delicate probe along a miniature crocodile, noting the subtle abrasions on its underbelly from repeated contact with gold dust. Historians still argue whether some observed wear was practical or ritualistic, though every mark offers clues to how these objects functioned in everyday life. Fringe tidbit. Some weights in private collections display unusual patonas, perhaps from being carried as charms or kept in proximity to other metals, subtly altering their appearance. You probably won't survive cataloging every unusual surface, but noticing them emphasizes that these objects lived lives beyond their initial creation. They were handled, treasured, and sometimes misunderstood, gaining layers of narrative that continue to ripple across time. You trudge through the intersection of scholarship and personal fascination. Modern encounters shape perception. An artifact admired in a quiet African village may be read as history, art, or commodity in a foreign gallery. Fringe tidbit. Some museums now collaborate with local communities to reinterpret weights, ensuring stories aren't lost or oversimplified. Historians still argue how much modern interpretation should influence historical understanding, but the dialogue itself breathes life into the objects, keeping them relevant across centuries. By the time you pause, you sense the tension between preservation, interpretation, and imagination. You probably won't survive remembering each collector, curator, or scholar, but the narrative that emerges is rich, The weights exist not only as objects, but as touchstones for human curiosity, scholarship, and appreciation. You trudge onward, aware that while the brass itself is small, its impact on understanding culture, commerce, and creativity is immense. These modern encounters are part of the story, reminding you that history is never truly static. It is continually rediscovered, reconsidered, and celebrated. You trudge onward, leaving modern galleries and collectors behind, and now your mind drifts toward the social and educational roles these weights played within West African communities. Imagine traders and apprentices learning to balance scales not just with gold, but with attention, patience, and cultural literacy. You probably won't survive remembering every lesson, but the essence is in noticing how these tiny objects carried knowledge across generations. Historians still argue whether formal instruction existed, or if knowledge was passed primarily through observation and oral tradition. Picture a young apprentice squinting at a tiny brass lion, carefully placing it on a scale while an elder corrects their hand placement. Fringe tidbit. Some apprentices reportedly learn to tell stories using the weights themselves, creating narratives that reinforced trade ethics, community norms, or spiritual lessons. You probably won't survive recounting all these oral traditions, but you can sense the rhythm of education embedded in everyday practice. Each weight becomes a teacher, every measurement a lesson in responsibility, accuracy, and cultural continuity. The educational use of weights extended beyond numerical skills. Traders and artisans also conveyed moral lessons, societal roles, and expectations through the symbolism embedded in the figures. Fringe tidbit. A crocodile weight might accompany a story about vigilance, while a dancer figure could illustrate grace, patience, or cooperation. Historians still argue whether these narratives were standardized across regions or highly localized, transmitted only among tightly knit communities. You trudge past scenes of collaborative learning, where younger traders watch and mimic older ones, gradually internalizing both technical skill and cultural nuance. Some weights were deliberately designed to be playful, exaggerating features to make lessons memorable. Fringe tidbit. A tiny figure with an oversized head might indicate wisdom, humorously reminding apprentices not to take their own authority too seriously. You probably won't survive catching every symbolic exaggeration, but the underlying educational philosophy is clear. Learning was tactile, visual, and narrative-driven. Trade ethics were encoded in weights too. Correctly using a weight meant honesty, precision, and integrity, values essential for sustaining trust in networks that spanned vast distances. You probably won't survive noting every subtle cue, but each brass figure becomes a kind of ethical compass, guiding hands and minds alike. Historians still argue whether this system was formalized or emerged organically through communal expectations, but the principle remains clear. Commerce was inseparable from morality. Fringe tidbit. Some weights included figures engaged in cooperative tasks, like to humans balancing a load, or animals interacting harmoniously, possibly as reminders that mutual respect and teamwork were valued in both trade and daily life. You trudge slowly past these collaborative scenes, absorbing the quiet lessons embedded in tiny interactions. You probably won't survive noticing every subtle interaction, but the patterns resonate, reinforcing social cohesion and collective understanding. Apprenticeship and mentorship extended beyond trade mechanics. Masters demonstrated symbolic meaning, folklore, and ritual significance alongside numeric accuracy. Fringe tidbit. Certain figures may have been intentionally humorous or absurd to spark curiosity, engagement, and memorability in young learners. Historians still argue how standardized these lessons were across different regions, but the consistent thread is that learning involved a blend of practicality, creativity, and moral instruction. By the time you drift past these imagined classrooms, you feel the resonance of education through tactile experience. You probably won't survive remembering every lesson, story, or subtle variation, but the combined impression is clear. West African gold weights were not just functional, they were instruments of cultural transmission, teaching not only trade and measurement, but ethics, social norms, and narrative understanding. You trudge onward, the rhythm of learning embedded in brass, flowing gently into your consciousness, a quiet testament to the power of human ingenuity, mentorship, and imagination across generations. You trudge onward, leaving the educational lessons behind, and now your mind drifts toward the rituals and ceremonies where gold weights carried significance beyond mere commerce. Imagine quiet courtyards, rhythmic drumming, and soft chants accompanying the careful placement of a tiny brass animal on a scale. You probably won't survive remembering every detail, but the experience is in sensing the spiritual pulse flowing through these actions. Historians still argue whether ritual use was primarily symbolic, practical, or a deliberate blend of both. Picture a figure of a lion being placed on an altar-like balance, not to weigh gold, but as part of a ceremonial offering. Fringe tidbit. Some rituals involved sequences of weights, arranged in a particular order to invoke ancestral protection, prosperity, or safe passage on trade journeys. You probably won't survive following every sequence, but the mental imagery highlights the intersection of material culture, belief, and social cohesion. Each weight becomes a conduit for unseen forces, a bridge between the tangible and the sacred. Animals held special ritual significance. Crocodiles, for instance, often represented both danger and guardianship. Elephants, wisdom and endurance. Birds, messages between worlds. Fringe tidbit. Some weights depict hybrid creatures, perhaps to convey mythical power, moral lessons, or hidden messages understood only by initiated observers. Historians still argue whether hybrids were purely fantastical or encoded specific local knowledge, yet their presence suggests playfulness and complexity in spiritual expression. You trudge through imagined ceremonial spaces, noting the careful alignment of figures, the precise sequences of gestures, and the deliberate order of events. Some rituals might have lasted hours, days, or even weeks, with weights serving as silent guides, reminders, or tools for divination. Fringe tidbit. Certain weights include abstract shapes, like spirals or dots, that could function as mnemonic devices for reciting genealogies, laws, or sacred stories. You probably won't survive decoding all these abstract codes, but the presence of such patterns adds depth to the ceremonial landscape. Human figures also carry ritual significance. Dancers, warriors, and everyday people are arranged in miniatures that evoke moral lessons, communal roles, or ancestral stories. You trudge past a tiny figure in mid-spin, imagining the original dance ritual it references, accompanied by song, drum, and the faint scent of incense or smoldering wood. Historians still argue whether exaggerated postures were purely symbolic or served practical purposes in storytelling, teaching, or divination. Even the physical act of weighing carried ritual meaning. Precision symbolized honesty, balance reflected moral order, and the repetitive motion of placing and removing weights invoked mindfulness and intention. Fringe tidbit. In some local traditions, a misweighed weight was seen as an ill omen, prompting a brief corrective ceremony or blessing. You probably won't survive cataloging each ritual nuance, but the interplay of commerce and ceremony is striking, revealing a society where ethics, spirituality, and practicality coexist seamlessly. You trudge through sequences of imagined ceremonies, feeling the rhythm of repetition, observation, and participation. You probably won't survive memorizing every arrangement, but the overall impression is a deeply interwoven system of meaning. Weights as tools, weights as teachers, weights as ritual objects, connecting communities to their past, their environment, and their shared moral universe. Fringe tidbit. Some ceremonial arrangements may have been intentionally playful or cryptic, encouraging reflection, storytelling, or even gentle humor among participants. By the time you pause, the ceremonial dimension of these weights leaves a lingering sense of reverence and subtle joy. You trudge onward, carrying with you the awareness that these small objects were never just metal. They were mediators of power, morality, spirituality, and play. Each miniature lion, crocodile, dancer, or hybrid creature pulses with cultural significance, forming a bridge between the practical and the sacred, the mundane and the extraordinary, weaving a quiet, enduring story across centuries. You trudge onward, leaving the ceremonial spaces behind, and your attention drifts to the stories embedded in the more unusual and fringe aspects of gold weights, the ones that scholars and collectors often debate, dismiss, or marvel at. These objects challenge expectations, blurring lines between humor, morality, politics, and play. You probably won't survive cataloging every oddity, but the essence is in noticing how these weights reveal a culture capable of complexity, subtlety, and whimsy. Historians still argue whether some of these designs were meant for amusement, coded communication, or secret messages understood by insiders. Imagine a weight depicting a figure, seemingly carrying an impossible loader basket, larger than their body. A tiny elephant balanced on the head, a child lifting what appears to be a village. Fringe tidbit. These exaggerations may have served as playful warnings, metaphors for responsibility, or lessons in exaggeration and humor. You probably won't survive decoding every intended joke, but feeling the light-hearted energy woven into these objects is part of the joy. Each exaggeration is a miniature performance, a wink across time from artisan to observer. Animals also feature prominently in these whimsical narratives. A crocodile might sport a mischievous grin, a lion be depicted chasing a monkey, or a hybrid creature combine multiple species in playful ways. Fringe tidbit. Some scholars suggest these were not merely humorous, but encoded moral lessons, warning of laziness, greed, or overconfidence in subtle, visually engaging ways. Historians still argue whether the audience was primarily children, apprentices, traders, or adults, but the ambiguity itself adds charm and intrigue. You trudge past dancers frozen mid-motion, some in impossible poses or with exaggerated limbs. The humor is subtle. A figure might be caught mid-stumble, a skirt flying at an odd angle, a head turned in overdop surprise. Fringe tidbit. Some weights may have included tiny hidden symbols, like a dot or line, known only to certain guild members or traders, a playful secret embedded within functional art. You probably won't survive spotting every hidden cue, but the presence of these secretive details makes each weight a layered experience, a conversation between maker and user. Even human interactions are exaggerated for effect. Two figures might appear to struggle comically over a load, A mother figure might bend so far backward she seems almost to defy physics. Or a hunter may miss his target in miniature slapstick fashion. Fringe tidbit. Some of these exaggerations may have functioned as mnemonic devices, helping apprentices remember stories, lessons, or sequences of trade etiquette. Historians still argue whether these humorous elements were intended for entertainment, pedagogy, or subtle critique of societal norms. You trudge through imagined social spaces where these playful weights circulate. Traders might chuckle, apprentices might mimic exaggerated gestures, and artisans may observe with quiet satisfaction. You probably won't survive cataloging each moment of human engagement, but the vibrancy of life and humor captured in metal becomes apparent. These weights are simultaneously functional, aesthetic, moral, and playful, a testament to a culture comfortable with subtlety and nuance. The integration of whimsy also strengthens social cohesion. By laughing at exaggerated forms or discussing hidden details, communities reinforced shared knowledge, values, and aesthetic sensibilities. Fringe tidbit. Some weights may have served as gentle social critiques, subtly mocking human foibles while remaining within acceptable cultural boundaries. You probably won't survive recalling every subtle implication, but the pattern emerges clearly. Play, humor, and creativity were inseparable from functionality and tradition. By the time you pause to rest, the whimsical dimension of these weights leaves you with a smile and a sense of curiosity. You trudge onward, carrying the gentle joy embedded in brass playfulness that survived centuries, traveling alongside commerce, ritual, and artistry. Each tiny figure, hybrid, or exaggeration becomes a bridge between past and present, a reminder that even in precision and utility, there is room for laughter, ingenuity, and imagination. You trudge onward, leaving whimsy behind, and now your focus shifts to the scholarly debates and mysteries surrounding West African gold. Waits the unanswered questions, contested interpretations, and tantalizing gaps in understanding. You probably won't survive remembering every academic dispute, but the beauty lies in sensing the ongoing dialogue across time. Historians, archaeologists, collectors, and local communities all weigh in, interpreting, challenging, and reinterpreting the evidence. Historians still argue whether some weights functioned primarily as currency, ritual objects, educational tools, or a combination of all three. Imagine a tiny brass lion resting on a scale while scholars pore over measurements, stylistic details, and wear patterns, each trying to reconstruct context and purpose. Fringe tidbit. A few rare weights feature unusual hybrid or abstract forms that resist categorization, sparking debate over whether they were experimental art, secret codes, or mistakes that somehow survived. You probably won't survive cataloging every argument, but the disagreements highlight the richness and complexity of these objects, tiny, yet endlessly layered. Debates often center on symbolism. Lions, elephants, and crocodiles may have multiple meanings depending on context, region, or era. Fringe tidbit. Some weights depict improbable scenes, like animals riding humans or humans balancing impossible loads, prompting discussion about whether these were moral lessons, jokes, or ritual instruction. Historians still argue which interpretations carry more weight, and every discovery tends to deepen the mystery rather than simplify it. You trudge through the world of measurement and mathematics as well. Some scholars argue that certain weights were designed with precise ratios for gold dust trade, while others suggest standardization was fluid, shaped by local practice and negotiation. Fringe tidbit. Some unusual weights deviate slightly from expected ratios, sparking speculation about whether these were experimental, symbolic, or errors preserved through chance. You probably won't survive remembering every precise calculation, but noticing the subtle variations is enough to appreciate the artisans. Sophistication. Questions of provenance are equally tangled. Weights have been found in villages, markets, riverbeds, and archaeological sites, but often with limited context. Fringe tidbit. Some weights may have traveled across regions through trade or gifting, yet their original communities remain unknown. Historians still argue whether these artifacts should be interpreted primarily through local contexts, regional networks, or broader cross-cultural comparisons. You trudge past discussions of production techniques. Lost wax casting, alloy composition, and polishing methods are debated for accuracy, origin, and intention. Fringe tidbit. Some weights show unusual metallurgical signatures suggesting experimental methods, local innovation, or even external influence. You probably won't survive tracking every technical nuance, but the discussion underscores the level of craftsmanship and ingenuity involved. The aesthetic debates are equally vibrant. Stylization, exaggeration, and abstraction vary across regions and eras, leaving scholars divided on whether certain features were functional, symbolic, or purely artistic. Fringe tidbit. Even minor details, like a dancer's tilted head or a subtle curl on a lion's tail, become points of lively contention. Historians still argue whether these micro-details reflect intentional messaging, regional identity, or accidental variation. You trudge through the cumulative weight of questions, realizing that much remains unknown. Fringe tidbit. Some weights have disappeared entirely, looted, lost, or melted down, leaving gaps in the historical record that scholars attempt to fill through inference and comparison. You probably won't survive tracing every hypothesis, but the ongoing dialogue reminds you that history is dynamic, constantly revised, and enriched by curiosity. By the time you pause, the scholarly and interpretive layers of these weights settle softly in your mind. You trudge onward, carrying the awareness that these objects are more than metal. They are conversation starters, puzzles, and bridges between generations of thought, observation, and imagination. Each brass animal, hybrid figure, and abstract shape invites reflection, wonder, and gentle debate, a silent testament to human creativity and the persistent allure of mystery. You trudge onward, leaving scholarly debates behind, and now your attention settles on the enduring legacy and modern appreciation of West African gold. Weights. The way these tiny objects continue to inspire, educate, and mesmerize. You probably won't survive cataloging every museum exhibit, collector, or classroom discussion, but the essence is in sensing how these artifacts connect past and present, bridging centuries through brass, symbolism, and shared human curiosity. Historians still argue whether modern interpretations honor or distort the original cultural significance, yet the fascination is undeniable. Imagine students leaning over glass cases in museums, tracing the delicate outlines of miniature lions, crocodiles, and dancers, whispering to each other about what the figures might mean. Fringe tidbit. Some educators use weights as interactive teaching tools, allowing learners to handle replicas, reconstruct sequences, or even perform measurement exercises, blending tactile learning with historical insight. You probably won't survive remembering every classroom scenario, but the playful engagement mirrors centuries-old traditions of hands-on apprenticeship. Artists and designers also draw inspiration from the forms, translating miniature brass figures into textiles, jewelry, digital art, and sculpture. Fringe tidbit. Contemporary creatives sometimes exaggerate features for effect, echoing the historical practice of playful distortion while preserving symbolic or aesthetic integrity. Historians still argue whether this adaptation represents homage, reinterpretation, or a subtle shift in meaning, but the continuity of influence is clear. You trudge through communities where replicas are produced for educational purposes, cultural preservation, or local commerce. Fringe tidbit. Some artisans intentionally recreate traditional casting techniques, teaching younger generations both craft and cultural literacy, blending heritage with livelihood. You probably won't survive noting every workshop, but the continuity of craft emphasizes the resilience and relevance of cultural practices over centuries. Cultural festivals and exhibitions showcase waits in ceremonial contexts, highlighting their historical role in trade, ritual, and social life. Fringe tidbit. Some modern presentations deliberately incorporate storytelling, music, and dramatization, bringing to life the small figures as performers in a larger narrative. You probably won't survive cataloging every festival, but the multi-sensory experience reflects the richness of the original context. Historians still argue how much modern interpretation should shape audience perception, yet the essence of engagement, wonder, curiosity, reflection remains intact. Collectors, museums, and scholars continue to document and debate, ensuring that these objects are studied, preserved, and appreciated across generations. Fringe tidbit. Digital archiving allows for 3D modeling, interactive exploration, and virtual exhibitions, expanding access to audiences worldwide. You probably won't survive tracking every project, but the innovation mirrors the historical adaptability of these objects themselves, demonstrating a timeless relevance. You trudge through the reflections on legacy, imagining how each weight, lion, crocodile, dancer, hybrid, or abstract form carries centuries of cultural memory, human creativity, and social significance. Fringe tidbit. Some modern enthusiasts even create personal interpretations, small stories, or games inspired by historical weights. A subtle continuation of playful engagement embedded in original designs. Historians still argue how much these contemporary uses mirror authentic historical intention, but the enduring fascination is undeniable by the time you pause to rest. The cumulative journey across markets, palaces, workshops, spiritual spaces, and scholarly debates settles gently in your mind. You feel the hum of brass and the whisper of history in every miniature figure you've imagined. Tracing paths across rivers, deserts, and centuries, you trudge onward, carrying with you the enduring legacy of ingenuity, humor, ritual, and learning, all crystallized in tiny brass objects that continue to inspire awe and wonder. Now, let your mind slow, your breath deepen, and your thoughts soften. Picture the warm glow of afternoon sunlight on polished brass, the quiet weight of history held in your hand, and the gentle, enduring rhythm of trade, creativity, and ritual flowing across time. You feel the echo of artisans' hands, traders' patience, and scholars' curiosity, all converging in this quiet, intimate moment. Let your imagination rest in the calm, the whimsical, the profounder world carried in miniature, alive in your mind, whispering stories of past lives, distant markets, and tiny symbols heavy with meaning. Now, as the night deepens and your mind grows softer, imagine the gentle glow of brass reflecting the faint light of a waning sun. Tiny figures standing quietly, patiently, each one a guardian of countless stories. You trudge slowly through memory and imagination, feeling the rhythm of rivers, markets, workshops, and courts, merging into one seamless tapestry of human endeavor. The elephants, lions, crocodiles, and dancers settle into your mind like old friends. Their miniature forms carrying lessons, humor, morality, and artistry. You probably won't survive noticing every nuance, but you feel the warmth, the rhythm, and the quiet weight of history pressing gently against your consciousness. Let your breath synchronize with this flow. Inhale the patience of apprentices, learning their craft. Exhale the curiosity of travelers and scholars, interpreting the forms. Picture each figure frozen in time, yet alive in your imagination. Each brass curve and detail vibrating with centuries of human experience. You trudge lightly across imagined riverbanks, bustling markets, and quiet palaces. Feeling the pulse of life, trade, and ritual resonate softly in your mind. Fringe tidbits. Even the tiniest hybrid creatures, with exaggerated limbs or whimsical features, echo the playfulness and subtle humor of a world long past but never forgotten. And now, as the night hums and your mind drifts, allow these gentle echoes to fade into calm. Imagine the sun setting softly, the river's murmur quieting, and the brass weights resting in stillness, holding their stories patiently for the next dreamer. You probably won't survive recounting every tale, but that doesn't matter. The resonance, the rhythm, and the quiet wonder linger, a gentle embrace of history, imagination, and restful reflection. Sweet dreams.